So just a reminder that when we're discussing, if you're in the room, you need to go to the mic in order for the people online to hear you. And if you are online and want to ask a question or chime in or just share your thoughts, you can use the hand raise function, and that way I will be able to see that you would like to share. Thanks for being here, everybody. I'm excited about this. Raise your hand if you feel generally familiar with Malcolm X. Most of us. Great. Raise your hand if you've ever read the autobiography of Malcolm X written by Alex Haley. Few? If you've seen the Spike Lee adaptation of that movie? Few others? Okay. Read any other books or biographies about him? Just wanted to get a sense of where we are in the room. So I'm excited to talk about Malcolm X because I feel like, especially during Black History Month, in largely white groups, it's really easy for us to stay in the comfort zone lane and talk about people that we already know about, that we already feel comfortable with, that we have sort of vetted to our standards as appropriate by whatever metrics we're using. But I think it's really important to take the opportunity to maybe move out of that comfort zone and to dig a little deeper, especially when that opportunity is presented to us so blatantly as it is in the month of February. So I hope we will gain a little bit better understanding of who Malcolm X was, and really where he fits in the sort of larger conversation about Black equality and rights and human dignity and that struggle in our country. So I'm going to start with some background information, and then we'll get into a little deeper of what he was about later in life. So Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. He was born to a mother, Louise, from Grenada, and his father, Earl, who was from Georgia. Earl was a Baptist minister, and he was also a follower of Marcus Garvey. Who's familiar with Marcus Garvey? A few. Oh, yay, that's great. So Marcus Garvey, as most of you already know, came to prominence in the 19-teens and 20s, and was sort of a leader in the Pan-Africanist movement, which sought to unite Africans in Africa with Black folks in the African diaspora in the United States, in the Caribbean, and so forth. He was part of a tradition, Black intellectual tradition of Black nationalism and separatism, which is contrasted with integration, the integrationist strain. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a little while. But it's important to understand this as part of Malcolm's own background, right? He had a father who was sort of already politically active in the Black nationalist, Black separatist movement. He was very outspoken. And actually, his father was killed by a streetcar when Malcolm was only about 6 years old. That was chalked up as an accident, but the family suspected that he had actually been killed for being a troublemaker by the Black Legion, which was a faction of the KKK, who had 2 years prior, when Malcolm was only 4, burned the family's house down. And so Malcolm came from this childhood of acute racial trauma, which is really important to keep in mind when we are looking at the rest of his life and how that unfolded for him. Also, Malcolm was a great student, extremely bright, and knew that about himself and thought, well, I would be a great lawyer. And he told his white teacher that he wanted to study law. He was the only Black student in this 8th grade class. And his teacher discouraged him, said, white people won't ever hire you for their lawyer, but you're good with your hands, so maybe you should consider becoming a carpenter. So needless to say, right, Malcolm was disillusioned and frustrated and unsupported, and he dropped out of school after middle school. And then ended up in a foster home when his mother had a nervous breakdown. The 6 children were split among various foster homes. Malcolm stayed for about 2 years before moving up to Boston with his half-sister Ella. And discouraged from his aspirations, Malcolm, found himself on the streets, gambling, pimping, hustling, racketeering, committing armed robberies, and ended up in prison by the time he was 20 years old. But it was in prison that he discovered the Nation of Islam. And first through another, a fellow inmate, and then he struck up a correspondence with the Nation of Islam leader at the time, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was not the founder of the Nation of Islam. That was a man named Wallace Fard, but he was the second leader of the Nation of Islam. And really, he was like a father to Malcolm in a lot of ways. Malcolm was a true believer in the Nation of Islam. He, in it, he found the structure and the purpose that really gave his life the direction that it lacked after, his experience as a young child, sort of dropping out of school and finding himself on the streets. And so in the Nation of Islam, he really found this sort of system of accountability. He found language of Black dignity and empowerment. And he found a father figure in the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Let's see here. It was in 1950, while he was still in prison, that first he began signing his name Malcolm X. The X that many members of the Nation of Islam use signifies the surname that was lost during slavery. So they, sort of distanced themselves from the last names given to them by their enslavers and used an X in that place. This was also the year, while he was still in prison, that the FBI opened a file on him, and they surveilled him for the rest of his life. In fact, they surveilled him so closely for the rest of his life that reading the FBI summary, Malcolm X's file, you can get a granular, almost daily accounting of his movements. Like, in some ways, a far fuller picture than any biographer could give you, because the FBI was paying such close attention to him. And it was after he wrote to President Truman in opposition of the war that he popped up on their radar and stayed. He was paroled in 1952 and rose quickly through the NOI ranks. He was a dazzling orator, very forceful speaker, very frank, very unafraid to say things that other people were afraid to say. And that was inspiring in a time when lots of Black Americans didn't feel the freedom to speak with their full voice and tell their full truth. And so for Malcolm to be willing to do that, it was a breath of fresh air, especially to the communities in the northern urban cities, Detroit, Harlem, Newark. He also opened new NOI temples in Springfield, Massachusetts, in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was by 1955, 3 years after he had been paroled from prison. He's already sort of the most visible minister in the Nation of Islam, has opened 3 temples, and has met his wife-to-be, Betty, with whom he has 6 daughters, 2 of whom are born after his assassination in 1965, twins. It was around 1957 that he became known generally to the general public because he criticized police brutality of one of the Nation of Islam members. If you have seen that Spike Lee movie, the adaptation of Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X, there's this really powerful scene with the Fruit of Islam members out in front of the police station because their member is being held inside, and they're agitating, and Malcolm holds up a fist, and in formation they turn and march away, and the white police officer says no man should have that kind of power. They were very scared of the kind of power that Malcolm had within the Black community. And that was for good reason. He was very powerful, and he was not afraid. Yeah, it's worth noting too that it was at this point that in 1957 that the NYPD began surveilling them, and the NYPD, the CIA, and the FBI eventually had their own infiltrate the Nation of Islam in New York, and probably had something to do with helping them decide to assassinate Malcolm in 1965. There's a great docu-series about this on Netflix called Who Killed Malcolm X? It's 6 parts. They're about 40 minutes per episode. So if you want to dig a little deeper, it's not only about who killed Malcolm X, it does also give a pretty good account of what he was about and, you know, sort of more of the context and the scenery. But if you want to dig a little deeper, that is still on Netflix. I checked last night. By 1962, Malcolm had become disillusioned with the NOI. He had learned about Elijah Muhammad's many sexual indiscretions, including with several very young, some underage secretaries of the Nation of Islam, some of which resulted in children. And so the Nation of Islam had and has this sort of very rigorous moral framework, set of moral expectations. No pork, now no alcohol, no sexual impropriety, no violent, no criminal activity, right? And so Malcolm, who had been this true believer for a decade or more now, was very disillusioned after learning that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was not abiding by the same rules that he preached. Any questions, comments, or, you know, to make here before we keep going? Yeah, Mark. Yeah. Yeah, sure. The question for those of you on Zoom or who couldn't hear is what the Nation of Islam is and what its relationship to Islam is. The Nation of Islam, it's an interesting question because it kind of depends on who you ask, right? It's certainly a religious movement. It's certainly a political movement. Depending on your perspective, you might put it in the cult category or partly in the cult category. It is certainly a religious sect. And it has a very sort of, the theology is a little off the wall insofar as like it holds that white people were created by a scientist. And so thematically, it holds that Black people are closest to the Islamic religion. But the Nation of Islam's brand of Islam bears little in common with Islam, the Abrahamic religion that we are mostly familiar with. It does worship Allah. It has sort of like Mormonism has its sort of own additional sacred texts and sacred myths. But it's arguably more important as a political and racial movement. Because the other thing that the Nation of Islam did really importantly, especially in the urban centers, right, was to set up Black businesses, was to set up like healthcare and Head Start. They were sort of doing what the Black Panthers eventually did in sort of taking these sort of social welfare framework into their own hands and into their own communities. Because they saw that they weren't going to get the same service from those social frameworks and safety nets because that white people were, because they saw that essentially they weren't the target audience for that. So they said, well, we're going to do it ourselves, right? Which is where it sort of falls in line with Marcus Garvey and that same Black separatist tradition, saying we can't count on on white American society to take care of us. So we're going to figure out how to do it within our own communities. I would say that that is arguably the most important function that the Nation of Islam has in the Black community, but I'm also not a Black person. So, and only a kind of scholar about this. And so you can probably find other information from experts of which I am not. Does that help a little bit? And Malcolm did eventually convert to Sunni Islam closer to the end of his life. And that was sort of life-changing for him. Are there any other questions or comments at this juncture before we move on? Okay. 1964 was a very big year for Malcolm X. This was the year that he left the Nation of Islam, and that came as a result of a combination of his own disillusionment with Elijah Muhammad that I spoke to a few minutes ago, but then also Elijah Muhammad's jealousy and some of his sons' jealousy of Malcolm. Malcolm was the most recognizable face of the Nation of Islam at this point. He was getting a lot of press. And for a lot of people, his name was sort of synonymous with the movement. That's what people knew about Malcolm X and about the Nation of Islam, right? Was together. And so Elijah Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad's sons were just as unhappy with Malcolm as Malcolm was with Elijah Muhammad. And so it was in 1964, after being silenced by the NOI and benched by them for a while, that Malcolm finally left and converted to Sunni Islam. And this was also the year that he went on pilgrimage, took the Hajj to Mecca, where his experience was transformative. While he was in Mecca, he saw Muslims of all different colors living in brotherhood together. And it was that experience that sort of shifted his perspective. He had been staunchly separatist up to this time, convinced that Black people and white people could not live harmoniously together. But on his pilgrimage, he saw Islamic Muslim brothers and sisters of various races who were living in harmony. And so now he saw Islam, true Islam, as perhaps the thing that could help transcend the racial segregation of this country in really much the same way that Martin Luther King saw his own Christianity, right? Both men looked to their faith as the thing that might unstick the racial situation in the United States. It was also in 1964 that, speaking of Dr. King, that Dr. King and Malcolm X met for the first and the only time that they actually met in person. And this was when they were both at the Senate debate on the Civil Rights Bill. And just as an aside, you may have seen there has been sort of in the ether for since 1964 or so, a very critical quote from Martin Luther King about Malcolm X, which just last year or the year before, just within the past 2 or 3 years, has been, it's been discovered that that quote was a fabrication. There are articles about that. You can Google it and an article will come up. There's lots of stuff about it. But if you want to read more about it, you can read, the article that so many, or the quote that so many people know about wherein Dr. King is so scathingly critical of Malcolm X. It's not a real quote at all, after all. Some of the parts are taken from other parts of the interview, and then some of the parts are just fabricated. But they were admirers of each other, although rhetorically very critical of one another. It was also in 1964 that he gave the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, which you might be familiar with. And I want to talk a little bit more about the content of that. But I want to give you all a chance to chime in before we head on. Are there any questions or comments? Yes. Okay. To discover which? Oh. Well, we can do this now. So the question, and I'll just repeat it for those who are on Zoom, is how, why me, why talking about Malcolm X? Is that what your question is basically? Fair. I minored in African American studies in college. In seminary, I focused in Black liberation theology. So I've known a lot about Malcolm X for a long time. Some of you who have seen if you've ever been on a Zoom call and you've seen my home office, or maybe you've seen this office, I have lots of sort of atypical iconography, non-traditional iconography. I also have, it's not on a wall that is picked up by the camera, but I also have one of Malcolm X on my wall of saints, because I think that he was such an important voice in, the struggle for Black dignity and Black rights. And I think that's really super freaking important. And so that's why. Is that kind of an answer? All right, thanks, Parker. Oops. The ballot or the bullet did a number of things. In this speech, he encouraged Black Americans to exercise their political power as a voting bloc, but he did maintain his skepticism that voting alone would bring about the equality sought. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement were much more optimistic that by winning the right to vote, they could transform American society. Malcolm looked around and did not share that optimism. So he did encourage Black people to find and wield that power, but he didn't think that alone was going to do the trick. In the speech, he also proposed to elevate the Black struggle from one of civil rights to one of human rights. And that meant for him moving it from a national scale, a US problem, to the global scale as a sort of human rights, humanitarian problem. And he even thought that maybe it could be brought as a case before the UN. And he contrasted asking Uncle Sam to treat you right, the sort of civil rights struggle, with insisting on the God-given rights recognized by all nations on earth. And so he thought that by elevating this conversation to a global stage, it might get the kind of traction and action that was really needed. He also reiterated his commitment to Black nationalism, but what we mean by this is not the same thing that we're talking about necessarily when we talk about Christian nationalism, right? Black nationalism, what we're talking about is self-governance, self-reliance, what I was talking about earlier about having Black-owned businesses, Black-owned preschools, the sort of social safety nets that support communities. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about Black nationalism. We're talking about self-reliance within Black communities. And along with that, encouraged the unity of the Black community. And he says, we have to see each other as brothers and sisters. We've got to come together with warmth so we can develop the unity and the harmony that's necessary to get this problem solved ourselves. Because Malcolm looked around and thought that, look, we cannot wait to rely on other people to solve this problem. It's clear that they're not interested in doing that, right? He also insisted on the right to self-defense. And this is where his reputation gets a little sticky, right? We're all familiar with the by any means necessary tagline that's associated with Malcolm X, right? But what Malcolm said over and over and over again is that in a nation where the aggressors have arms, it is only reasonable for those who are suffering armed aggression to at least have the right to defend themselves against it, right? But along with his own moral code post-prison and what the Nation of Islam taught, he always discouraged folks from breaking the law. He said, we don't do criminal activity, right? We're not going out looking for, trouble to cause, right? But when trouble finds us, we're going to be prepared to fight back against it. He himself led this very upright life in his post-prison life, so much so that the FBI was pretty frustrated about it in their own quest to find, good dirt about Malcolm X. And they complained that he was such a Boy Scout, right? No sexual impropriety, no drinking, no pork, no violence, no criminal behavior. They just couldn't find any dirt on Malcolm X at all. Another quote from the speech: "This doesn't mean you're going to get a rifle and form battalions and go out looking for white folks. That would be illegal, and we don't do anything illegal." And then finally, he predicted in this speech that Black Americans would rise up with arms if the Civil Rights Bill didn't pass. Just looking at the lay of the land, this was not a call to violence, right? This was not prescriptive, but a descriptive prediction based on the general and quite deep discontent of Black Americans, which was why there was a Civil Rights Bill on the floor in the first place. Before we move on, any questions or comments here? Yes. That's a really good question. I believe he gave this speech several times in various mosques, NOI mosques across the country, actually. And so he was giving it sort of generally as sort of a rallying cry to the Black community, which is why he gave it in a lot of different locations, contexts. Yes.
You said he became disillusioned with the Nation of Islam, but at this point he's still involved with it, or had he already left? And what did he?
He is.
He's a Sunni, but does he have a mantle that?
I did a little, good question. I did a little sort of fast forwarding with the bio stuff. At this point, he is still in the Nation of Islam. Yes, Scott.
What you say, everything skeptical about voting being a real power change, but what did he think? The Black vote was really suppressed anyway. Did he kind of give up on trying to use the Civil Rights Act to get greater participation by the Black community, or did he just move on from that, or did somebody else deal with it? Voting, even today, very much an issue that hasn't been resolved.
Right. Well, I mean, he certainly didn't think he thought that Black people should pull every lever available to them, right, to sort of change the scenery, change the lay of the land, and to be rewarded equal rights finally. But he just didn't count on that as something that would get the job done, right? And so it was never his primary focus. He mentions it in this speech, but it's never for him a top priority. For him, the top priority is Black self-love and dignity, Black self-sufficiency, and sort of cooperation within the Black community to sort of take care of one another and to lift each other up. There's the famous interview clip with Martin Luther King. You may have seen it. It takes place in a church, and in this clip, Dr. King is saying, something about like our American ideal of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. And he says it's awfully cruel to expect that of people who don't even own boots, right? That's what Malcolm was focusing on, getting people boots, right? They're doing this sort of like organizing work in support of the community. Right? That's the most important thing, is that people have what they need to live and to survive and to flourish as human beings first, right? We got to get people boots. Yes.
So this speech what made him much more. Was this speech what brought him more attention from the average white family?
This certainly was one of the things that got him on the map and on the radar. But unfortunately, during Malcolm's life, most of the attention that he got from white folks was negative attention. He got on people's radar by saying inflammatory things that made white folks real uncomfortable. I don't think there were a lot of white folks listening to this speech. I think that Malcolm got on people's radars with the police brutality thing in 1957 in New York. I think he got on people's radars in 1963 when John F. Kennedy was shot. And he said, He said basically that it is, sort of the logical outcome of the way that the country is. He used the term chickens coming home to roost, and that got him in, as you can imagine, quite a lot of hot water. That was one of the reasons that he was benched by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Not that Elijah Muhammad disagreed with him, but that he didn't like the negative attention that this comment had gotten him from, and the NOI, the scrutiny that it had brought upon the NOI. But yeah, I think that most of what landed Malcolm on the radar of white folks during his life was the inflammatory stuff that got people pretty scared. Unfortunately, it was hard for white America to receive. This was a really stringent message, right? A really he did not try to make it palatable, right? He wanted to be able to say the truth as he understood it and be heard in his truth. And that was not really the way things were done in the 1950s and 60s across racial lines. Anything more here before we move on? Anything from anyone online? Let's see whether, I don't see any hands. Okay. Malcolm X was assassinated in February of 1965. Now, 2 days before his assassination, on the 19th, he told interviewer Gordon Parks that he knew that the Nation of Islam was trying to kill him. And it was just 2 days later, on February 21st, that in fact they did. It was at Harlem's Audubon Ballroom. He had just gotten up to begin a speech when there's a commotion in the crowd, and Malcolm is shot from, they think, 3 guns, 2 automatic handguns, semi-automatic handguns, and a sawed-off shotgun. The autopsy recorded 21 gunshot wounds. So this is a case of just absolutely brutal overkill, with his pregnant wife and 4 daughters sitting right near the front. 3 members of the Nation of Islam are convicted: Talmadge Hayer, who confessed, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson, both of whom maintained their innocence. And Talmadge Hayer, on the stand and in prison, also maintained their innocence. He said, there were 4 other people besides me who were involved in this, and Norman 3X and Thomas 15X were none of them. Those 2 men are completely innocent. Even so, no judge ever consented to rehear their case. They were paroled much, much later. They were finally, what's the word? The sentence, they're exonerated is the word. They were finally exonerated in 2021. After one had died by that point. But Malcolm is killed in 1965. The NOI are certainly involved in some way. But the way that was handled and prosecuted was certainly not justice, I don't think we would call it. And it was also revealed in 2021, when those 2 were exonerated, that the FBI and the NYPD had withheld evidence at trial. A new trial has not been granted, but the family did bring a lawsuit February of last year, February 2023. Malcolm X's family brought a lawsuit against the FBI, the CIA, and the NYPD for concealing evidence and for their own involvement in that murder. And I mentioned the Netflix documentary or docuseries a few minutes ago, but I'll plug it again for more information just around the assassination specifically, but also about Malcolm's life and ministry generally. Before we get into Malcolm and Martin, I want to pause here again and just ask for questions or comments. Yes, Nancy. Thank you, Jay.
I just want to commend people's attention. I just saw this weekend the movie Rustin, which is a fabulous movie produced by the Obamas, but about Bayard Rustin, who was a openly gay man in the early 60s, who was the person who helped manage all the different groups that were in this civil rights space, who were all fighting against each other to produce the March on Washington. And
Right.
the systems he put up, the way he managed this in a really contentious Nicene kind of environment is really fascinating. So I commend that. It sort of goes mostly to this next period.
Yeah.
Where I think Malcolm is already dead. I can't remember the timing exactly, but he may have been in one of the early parts of this story. But it's really, I commend that to everybody. It is a fabulous movie.
I have not seen that yet, but it is on my list. Thank you, Nancy. Anything else?
When you were talking about how some of his rhetoric upset people, and it just occurred to me, went through my mind. If you look at Old Testament prophets and Jesus, New Testament prophet, they upset people. And then it occurred to me, if your message isn't upsetting some people, you're probably not a prophet.
Right. I think that's a really good litmus test for the prophetic, right? I mean, the prophetic is always counter to the status quo. And so if it's not a little bit uncomfortable, it's probably not truly prophetic. I agree with that wholeheartedly. So this is a wonderful book, Malcolm and Martin and America, Dream or Nightmare. This is by theologian James Cone, whom a lot of you are familiar with. And he writes, although the media portrayed them as adversaries, Malcolm and Martin were fond of each other. There was no animosity between them. They saw each other as fellow justice fighters struggling against the same evil, racism, and for the same goal, freedom for African Americans. And again, I'll say that rhetorically, they were very critical of one another, right? But rhetoric is a very different thing than personal regard, right? They were rhetorically very critical of each other, but they admired one another. We're never adversaries, but as I mentioned earlier a little bit, they came from very different traditions in Black American intellectual history, right? The integrationist tradition versus the nationalist or separatist tradition. Integrationists obviously hoped that if white Americans truly believe in their founding documents, they will have to eventually concede that Black Americans should be treated as equals and to make it so. So there's this sort of, hope in that human goodness will prevail in the integrationist strand of thinking. Frederick Douglass, famously part of this tradition. W.E. Du Bois, also famously part of this tradition. And of course, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Or his part of the civil rights movement, I'd say. And then the nationalists, on the other hand, are not so optimistic, right? They say that there have been 244 years of slavery, and that was followed by legal segregation, by political disenfranchisement, by social degradation, by economic exploitation, right? And so that given all of that, given the whole history of the thing, and the reality of the thing, that Black Americans will never be fully recognized and integrated into white society, not in a truly equitable way, and should therefore develop their own institutions and systems of social support, right? So we have David Walker in that category, Booker T. Washington is in that category, the Black Panthers, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X. Any questions here before we move on? Oh, yeah, go
So
ahead.
what was the response to his assassination?
Well, I think that depends on who you ask, right? The response in the Black community was one of deep sorrow.
Islam?
Well, the
Yeah, 'cause
nation.
I would think would members of Nation of Islam also be choosing sides at this point?
Yes, at this point, the Nation of Islam is very divided. Malcolm X is is so charismatic and so well-liked and so powerful within the nation. But then you also have sort of the loyalists, right, who are taking Elijah Muhammad's side of things. And so you had a lot of division on this within the Nation of Islam itself. But I do think that overall, except for the people who really stood to gain from Malcolm's assassination, people thought it was a terrible shame, you know, even if they weren't on Malcolm's side of the NOI. Okay. So, whereas Martin Luther King had a dream for the future of the country, Malcolm was looking around at what he saw going on around him and saw instead a nightmare. And this is from him. What is looked upon as an American dream for white people has long been an American nightmare for Black people. And so we have the ideological traditions, the different traditions that they came for, of course, but their childhood experiences also really contributed to the difference in the perspectives of these two men, right? So as we noted earlier, Malcolm was scarred by racial trauma at a very early age, first with his house burning down when he was 4, set by the KKK, and then with his father killed when he was 6, probably by the same group, although they were never punished or, you know, prosecuted for it. And then, you know, the experience with the white teacher saying, no, you can't be a lawyer, be a carpenter. And so like Malcolm came out of a sort of lower economic strata. They struggled more. And then he had all of this racial trauma in his background. Whereas Dr. King's childhood is much more protected, much more privileged, and he comes from sort of a prosperous family that's running one of the biggest and most important Black churches in the South. Malcolm says, you should not be angry with me if I raise my voice. When you see a man on a stove and he yells, ouch, why, he should be allowed because he knows what it feels like to suffer. Sometimes Malcolm was referred to as the angriest Negro in America. And Malcolm was really just fine with that title. He couldn't understand why others weren't angry, right? And so he insisted over and over again that speaking his truth with honesty was not the same thing as the hatred that he was accused of. It's not hate. I'm talking to you about my experience and this history with honesty, you know? It sounds like anger, and I am angry, but it's not hatred, right? Let's not get them mixed up. Any questions here before we move on, or comments? Oops, we won't start that yet. Going on. Okay. This is just under 2 minutes. Let's hear him in his own words. Oh.
Day with no badge or no white skin or no white sheet or no white anything else. The police the same way. They put their club upside your head and then turn around and accuse you of attacking them. Every case of police brutality against a Negro follows the same pattern. They attack you, bust you all upside your mouth, and then take you to court and charge you with assault. What kind of democracy is that? What kind of freedom is that? What kind of social or political system is it when a black man has no voice in court? Nothing on his side other than what the white man chooses to give him. My brothers and sisters, we have to put a stop to this. And it will never be stopped until we stop it ourselves. They attack the victim, and then the criminal who attacked the victim accuses the victim of attacking him. This is American justice. This is American democracy. And those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail. But if you can't prove that a democracy is not hypocrisy, then don't put your hands on me.
Thoughts, comments?
But he was really, very new on the phone home and was like,
Indeed. Yeah, he just wanted to be able to say it out loud. We have a comment on online in the chat that I haven't mentioned Black Power yet, which is a good point. There's a sense in which Malcolm X is sort of the founder of the Black Power movement, sort of the progenitor of the Black Power movement as it took shape, you know, after his death. So thank you, Barbara Ordway, for that comment. Any other questions or comments before we discuss this little excerpt, this little clip a little more? He says, what kind of social or political system is it when a Black man has no voice in court, has nothing on his side other than what the white man chooses to give you? My brothers and sisters, we have to put a stop to this, and it will never be stopped until we stop it ourselves. Democracy is hypocrisy. If democracy means freedom, why aren't our people free? If democracy means justice, why don't we have justice? If democracy means equality, then why don't we have equality? Fair point, right? So while Dr. King was optimistic about the ability of nonviolence and his Christian ideals to persuade white Americans to give Black people equal rights, Malcolm didn't see any basis for that optimism. His experience of democracy was that it did not support and function of him or people who looked like him, that it was not intended to, that it was in effect hypocritical, that it was disingenuous. What do you make of this critique? What do you make of his critique of American democracy as it was functioning, as arguably continues to function, vis-a-vis the rights of Black Americans? Was he right? Penny.
Somehow, Sarah, when you read the newspapers and you follow what's happening in our country, there's not a lot that's changed.
Right.
And I would wonder, he could say those same words standing right up there where you are today, and it would be true.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Penny, I think that's a great point, right? A lot of it hasn't changed. Do you think, like, I wonder, could he stand up here and say the things that he said in the way that he said them? Would we have ears to hear him now? Or would we say, you're shouting too much? You're too angry. I can't hear you when you yell so loud. You know, I think that's a legitimate question for us. Just a sec.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
The thing that I'm struck by is that, so today we have seen made public countless cases of police brutality, such that I think a fair number of us, white people, now understand that that is and has been for decades the reality. At that time that he was saying this, people didn't know that. And it probably sounded like, you know, something he was concocting, you know. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, he saw a reality that at that time nobody really could see.
No white people.
No white people could really see.
Unless they're
And now, because there have been so many countless cases that have been made public, in part because everybody has a cell phone now and can record what's happening. It's not, I mean, it doesn't, to me, it's, and to all of us here, it sounds like, well, yes, that's exactly, we know that's true now. When he was saying that, it didn't, to white people, it probably sounded like he was making something up.
Well, I mean, yeah, I take your point. I do think that certainly things are a lot more visible to us, right? Like I'm thinking about Gaza, right? We know what's going on a level that we wouldn't have, you know, just a few years ago in Gaza because of our cell phones. And I think that's a great point, that we get sort of a front row seat to things such that it's much harder to deny. I think that Malcolm would probably say to the white people of his time that if they wanted to know what was happening in terms of police brutality, they absolutely could have, right? Because it was often, it was just in any old city or town in America, right? It wasn't just the ones that made the headline news or the ones that he sort of put himself, on the newspaper for talking about. So I think he might have said, angrily, you could know about it if you wanted to know about it. But I do think that it's a fair point that it's much harder to deny at this point when we all have phones in our pocket. Yeah. Nancy.
I was just thinking that if we go back to that head, I mean, this neighborhood was redlined,
Mhm.
Much of Bethesda, much of Washington even was redlined. And so people were isolated in their immediate communities. So I think that contributed to that, lack of awareness, and probably strong feelings, that just because they didn't know anybody. And so this was threatening because they didn't know. But anyway, just
Yeah, it's interesting the way in which sort of segregation created its own insular bubbles, right, for white people as well. Yeah. Denise.
During this time, I was living in the South, and I saw that white people received this with a lot of fear and a lot of anger. And I think that, a lot of people were really fearful of this, that the power behind Malcolm X and his movement. And so I think a lot of, the response from the white community was through fear and anger.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. Let's see. I think I've got something in the chat here. Let's see. Barbara Ordway shares that in inner city Baltimore, some of her elementary students were proud of themselves because of him. Yeah, I think that there's just the sort of Malcolm X was speaking a language of black dignity and black self-love that hadn't really been heard on a platform like this before, right? And he was talking to people who hadn't really been given this vocabulary of self-love and dignity in this way. And so, yeah, I think he was hugely important for that. Thank you for pointing that out, Barbara. And then Cindy Anderson, yes, says TV news shows Birmingham, et cetera. Yes, yes, making the point that white folks just wanted to deny, and we still live there if we're on. Any other comments here before we move on? I think I see one from Parker up here too.
What violence, it sounds like self-defense or police brutality, but like, what was the actual action that was happening that was tied to them that made people fearful?
It was the rhetoric. It was the rhetoric. Yeah.
Uprising,
Nope.
violent acts?
Yeah, just giving voice to, it seems reasonable to defend ourselves against against violence. Just giving voice to that was the cause of that fear. Yeah. We have one from Parker, and then we've got one in the back.
I think the thing that underlying too is his speech of self-love was not taken away or in any way meant to put the other on a low. And I think that's the ongoing problem we see with the dynamic between the races in America is that, Black people socialize I can't speak for all people, but many groups socialize their children to be
under the radar because after decades and decades of hearing that you are those things, they're trying to keep their children in not having mistakes. So we're not doing it because we don't think we're equal, but we want to survive. And I think there is kind of a blend between the Malcolm and the MLK mindset. But Malcolm was saying, like, stand up, go deeper, be aware, love yourself. And that self-love helps you present requiring feeling entitled to equality, which I think, we're in a fear dynamic of one fear the other. I think that's the thing that, we love, we have to break through and come.
Thank you, Parker. Yeah, perfect. We've got a comment in the back and then we'll come to you.
I think part of the dynamic that is important in the context, at least up until 1964, when he left the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam's views, part of the fear was two components. One, the Nation of Islam views white people as devils, literally, and that was a consistent part of the rhetoric from the 50s up until then, that you literally can't trust the devil. And two, the sort of underlying core call of the Nation of Islam was essentially aggressive segregation with reparations. So to cleave out a Black nation in the United States with land and resources for people to live independently and get away from the white devils. And so I think that's an important part of the fear component. Was the ultimate vision was, yes, we have to have self-love and we have to have community, but without Satan and with a little bit of money to help get it off the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Do we have one more comment?
We need
batteries
in the bike too.
Okay, we're running real short on time, so I'm going to keep rolling forward. So we have this sort of interesting relationship of these sort of theological concepts of justice, hope, and love. Whereas Martin Luther King focused on achieving justice for Black people through the sort of like radical sacrificial love for white people in the hope that it would eventually transform the hearts and the minds and the policies of the oppressor. For Malcolm, love of Black people was his primary focus and his driving force. And so justice became his highest theological priority. For Martin, his hope was grounded in his understanding of God's universal love as expressed through the figure of Jesus. Malcolm's hope was expressed through his belief in God's love for Black people and the coming judgment of white America. The idea that finally, in the end, God is going to make things right, on behalf of the oppressed. And so we won't get into a discussion here, but I want you to think about your own configuration right here. What is the relationship for you in your own theology between these three concepts, justice, hope, and love? How do they interact? What's primary? What needs to be the foundation? What's your sort of prioritizing in your own theology, your own spirituality of these three, justice, hope, and love? And where do you overlap with Martin and where do you overlap with Malcolm? Right.
There's something right about what they're saying.
Yeah, right. So whereas Martin's central theological focus was on love, Malcolm's was on justice. And we know the ways in which the American media and the general public have sort of divided them. We like to think of them as opposite ends of a spectrum, but I think it's more helpful if we understand them as two sides of the same coin. Right? We do need both love and justice in this struggle to build a society where everybody can flourish. And you might be familiar with Dr. Cornel West's famous quote that justice is what love looks like in public. And I love this. I love that. It really highlights the inseparability of the two. Might also consider the way that Malcolm's demonization, right, and sort of like unpalatability in the eyes of white America made Malcolm more successful, or made Martin Luther King more successful right? With Malcolm as seen as the sort of like militant alternative, like the foil to Martin's peaceful movement. You know, white America sort of looked at the choice and went, well, we can get on board with this nonviolent solution, right? We can't sort of stomach whatever it is that Malcolm's over here talking about. I think it's arguably the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's nonviolent civil rights movement would not have been nearly as successful without Malcolm being Malcolm, right? And you know, speaking truth to power in his, you know, unabashed and unafraid way. There you go. Yes. But it's also useful to spot the false dichotomy. Dr. King preached nonviolence, but he also did not rule out self-defense. There were often armed people around him to protect him. After his house was firebombed, he had armed guards until Bayard Rustin said, you can't have those armed guards around your house and fully live out this ethic of nonviolence that you are promoting. And so that was then that he decided to do away with the armed guards. But, you know, which is all to say, it's a false dichotomy to say that, you know, Martin was only about turn the other cheek and Malcolm was all about self-defense. Everybody wants to defend themselves against violence, right? So to wrap up here, we're at 11, but I want to highlight Malcolm's legacy of Black self-love, right? Malcolm over and over again insisted, Black is beautiful, insisted on Black dignity, on Black pride and self-love and self-sufficiency, and Black liberation by any means necessary, right? Which is another way of saying we are not done here until our people are free, right? I'm, you know, like you can hear echoes of Moses here. And James Cone writes, only someone who shared their lot could have said to the Black masses what Malcolm did. They knew he loved them enough to die for them. When Blacks hear Malcolm, they begin to see themselves in a new light, more possessed of an inner freedom than ever before. He was a shining example of Black courage in the face of forces intent on destroying it. He was not afraid to speak his rage plainly, to speak frankly his truth to power. He was not cowed or intimidated by a society intent on putting Black people, but especially Black men, in their place, right? And that made him uniquely inspiring and uniquely intimidating, depending on who you are. Quote from him, I don't want you to think in the statements that I make that I'm being disrespectful towards you as white people. I'm being frank. And I think my statements will give you a better insight on the mind of a Black man than most statements you get from people trying to get some of the crumbs that you might let fall from your table. I'm not looking for crumbs, so I'm not trying to delude you. It's a great one. And then James Cone calls Malcolm X a cultural revolutionary who single-handedly transformed the way Black people thought about themselves, the progenitor of the Black consciousness movement and the Black power movement that emerged during the 1960s. And I wish I had time to take more questions, but I've got to go get vested for our 11:15 service. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. I really appreciate it.